Kalari's breath came fast and shallow as she stared at the glossy black substance encasing her arm. The adhesive had dried in seconds, forming a bond that resisted every frantic attempt to free herself. The edges of the industrial workbench dug into her ribs as she shifted, but her forearm remained firmly fused to the surface, unyielding. Around her, the low hum of the repair station's machinery droned on, oblivious to her rising panic. She swallowed hard. The adhesive was designed for high-stress environments, used to patch hull breaches, seal atmospheric compartments and hold failing ship components together. Once bonded, the material was resistant to solvents, temperature extremes and mechanical force. And now it had claimed her arm. The station's medics and engineers stood at a cautious distance, whispering among themselves. None dared meet her gaze. The whispers were unnecessary. Kalari already knew what they would say. Amputation. The logical solution. The only solution. Her people were fragile. Beneath her pale lavender skin, her bones were thin, reinforced by a lattice of crystalline structures that made her lightweight and agile in low gravity but brittle under stress. If they tried to pry her free, her radius and ulna would snap before the adhesive even weakened. And the chemicals necessary to dissolve the polymer could eat through organic tissue just as easily. Kalari clenched her jaw. This was it. She would lose an arm. A shadow passed over her. A human, tall, broad-shouldered, his uniform smudged with streaks of oil and dust from the station's machinery. His sleeves were pushed up, revealing tanned forearms lined with faded scars. He had the look of a man accustomed to repairing broken things. James Carter. She had seen him before, speaking in that animated way humans did, always grinning, always moving. He was a senior engineer, well regarded among his kind. But what was he doing here? Hell of a mess, James murmured, crouching down to get a better look at her arm. His brown eyes flicked between her and the adhesive. You okay? Kalari frowned. It was an absurd question. She was about to lose an arm and he was asking how she felt? I am functional, she said stiffly. James snorted. Yeah, that's the kind of answer I'd give if I was absolutely not okay. Kalari's mandibles twitched. I assume you came to confirm what we already know. The bond is permanent. Amputation is the only course of action. James rocked back on his heels, considering her. Permanent? That's a strong word. He rubbed his chin. Seems to me that if we put it there we can take it off. There is no solvent that will. Ah, but that's just it, he interrupted. You're thinking about what won't work. I'm thinking about what might. Kalari stared at him. The station's medical team and engineers have already determined. I'm not them. He grinned and the expression startled her. It was so unworried. You're not losing your arm today. She opened her mouth to argue, to tell him that his optimism was misplaced, but he had already turned away. With a snap of his fingers he signaled for a toolbox. One of the nearby engineers hesitated, then pushed a rolling case toward him. James flipped it open and began sifting through its contents with an ease that suggested he was in his element. Kalari exhaled sharply. This is foolish. He didn't look up. Probably. Humans take unnecessary risks. James grinned again. And we fix impossible problems. The other engineers and medics exchanged glances but said nothing. No one stopped him. Perhaps because humans had a reputation for exactly this kind of reckless ingenuity. James ran his fingers over the surface of the adhesive, then tapped it lightly, listening to the sound. He withdrew a small handheld scanner, running it over the material's surface. The device beeped, displaying chemical compositions and structural data. Okay, he murmured to himself. Solvents are out. Heat's a no-go. Mechanical force. Risky. He turned back to her. How much pain tolerance do you have? Kalari tensed. Why? Because I have an idea, but it's not going to be comfortable. She hesitated. Part of her wanted to refuse. To tell him he was wasting time. But the other part, the part that did not want to wake up tomorrow missing a limb, found itself asking what if. I have endured worse, she said. James nodded. Good answer. He retrieved a fine-tipped tool that emitted a barely visible vibration. This is a precision ultrasonic cutter. Normally we use it for delicate repairs, but if I adjust the frequency, there's a chance it could weaken the adhesive without damaging your skin. Kalari inhaled sharply. A chance. It was better than nothing. Proceed. The first pass sent a strange tingling through her bones. It wasn't pain, but it wasn't pleasant either. James adjusted the settings, his brow furrowed in concentration. The tool whined softly as it passed over the surface of the adhesive, and for the first time Kalari dared to hope. But after several attempts, James let out a frustrated breath. Damn. It's working, but not enough. The bond is too deep. She closed her eyes briefly. Of course. Hope was an unreliable thing. James sat back, rolling his shoulders. Okay, plan B. There is a plan B. There's always a plan B. He ran a hand through his hair, thinking. If brute force and precision won't cut it, we get creative. Kalari exhaled. Humans are persistent. You say that like it's a bad thing. He shot her another grin. Hang tight, Kalari. We're not done yet. She didn't respond. She wasn't sure she trusted him. But she found herself wanting to. And that was perhaps the most dangerous part of all. James paced beside the workbench, rubbing his chin, his mind already leaping ahead to the next possible solution. The ultrasonic cutter had been a good idea, but the adhesive's molecular density was too high. It absorbed vibrations instead of weakening. If he wanted to free Kalari's arm without risking her bones, he needed something unconventional. She watched him with a mixture of curiosity and exasperation. He was an anomaly, this human. Most engineers would have walked away after the first failure, deferring to medical protocols. But James had latched onto the problem with the tenacity of a predator locked onto prey. It was both admirable and utterly bewildering. You're taking this rather personally, she noted, flexing the fingers of her trapped hand. She could still move them, but a dull ache was setting in, a sign of restricted circulation. James stopped pacing and shot her a grin. I don't like losing. That is an irrational mindset. Maybe. He crouched beside her again, tapping his fingers against the workbench. But if humans gave up every time something seemed impossible, we'd still be sitting in caves waiting for lightning to strike wood. Kalari tilted her head. Your species' technological progress is driven by stubbornness? Pretty much. He nodded toward the other engineers and mechanics still lingering nearby. We're also good at throwing ideas at a problem until something sticks. Watch. Without waiting for permission, James straightened and turned to the gathered crew. All right, folks, I need some out-of-the-box thinking. No bad ideas. How do we get an alien's arm unstuck from an unbreakable adhesive without snapping it in half? The group hesitated, exchanging looks. A Lorthian technician with dark iridescent scales clicked his mandibles. Dissolving agents are out of the question. Heat might cause nerve damage. You could try freezing it. Freezing? James rubbed his hands together. You mean like cryowelding principles? Extreme cold weakens molecular bonds. The technician bobbed his head. In theory, yes. But you would need a method that targets only the adhesive, not her flesh. James turned back to Kalari. How do you handle the cold? She hesitated. Lower temperatures slow my circulation, but it would not be immediately harmful. Good enough. James snapped his fingers. We mix precision cooling with microvibrations. We lower the adhesive's elasticity, then apply controlled stress fractures. It might be just enough to break the bond. Kalari exhaled slowly. He made it sound so simple. But the risk remained. Even if they weakened the adhesive, there was no guarantee they wouldn't damage her arm in the process. James seemed to sense her hesitation. He lowered his voice. Look, I get it. You don't trust this plan yet. Hell, I don't even know if it'll work. But I'm not giving up on you, so you might as well give me the chance to prove myself right. Something about the certainty in his voice unsettled her. He wasn't promising a miracle. He wasn't even claiming absolute confidence. But there was something else. An unshakable belief that trying was better than surrendering. She found herself nodding. Proceed. Within minutes, James had a makeshift station set up. One of the mechanics handed him a portable coolant system, typically used to regulate engine components. Another provided a low-frequency vibration generator repurposed from industrial diagnostic tools. The combination was crude, but James worked quickly, adjusting settings with careful precision. All right, he murmured, positioning the coolant dispenser over the adhesive. This is going to feel weird. A fine mist hissed against the surface of the bond, forming a delicate layer of frost. Kalari's skin prickled at the sudden cold, her nerves screaming in protest. The adhesive darkened, its once glossy sheen dulling as the extreme temperature altered its properties. James waited only a few seconds before activating the vibration tool. A subtle hum filled the air. Kalari felt the tremors traveling up her bones, a sensation not unlike the low thrum of a starship's engine beneath her feet. The adhesive crackled softly. James adjusted the frequency, watching closely. Come on, come on. A sudden pop echoed in the quiet room. The frozen adhesive fractured along microscopic stress points, its grip loosening just slightly. Kalari's breath hitched as she felt movement, just a fraction, but enough to know that James had done something none of the station's medical staff had managed. James exhaled sharply. Hell yeah, we've got progress. Kalari flexed her fingers again, this time feeling less resistance. Hope flickered inside her, unfamiliar and cautious. James grinned. Told you we're not done yet. But before he could continue, an alarm blared through the station, cutting through the air with shrill urgency. The overhead lights flickered to emergency red. A voice crackled through the intercom. Attention all personnel, containment breach detected in Sector 6. Immediate lockdown protocols engaged. Kalari stiffened. A lockdown meant restricted movement. If they didn't finish the process now, she could be trapped like this for hours. James muttered a curse under his breath. Of course this would happen now. Kalari forced herself to stay calm. You should evacuate. This is no longer a priority. James scoffed. Yeah, not happening. He adjusted the coolant dispenser, increasing the intensity. The frost thickened over the adhesive, deepening the cracks. I need just a little more time. A second alarm rang, followed by a station-wide power fluctuation. The coolant system flickered, the vibration generator stuttered. Kalari felt her stomach tighten. We do not have time. James set his jaw. Then we make time. He grabbed a handheld multi-tool from his belt, adjusting it rapidly. If we can't finish this the slow way, we go for controlled detachment. She stared at him. Explain. James flipped open a compartment on the device, revealing a plasma filament. We superheat just the fractures. Quick, precise application. It forces separation without a full rebonding reaction. Kalari swallowed hard. It was dangerous. Reckless. But then again, she had already learned humans never stopped at impossible. She gave him a single nod. Do it. James tightened his grip on the tool. Hold on, Kalari. This is gonna be fast. The adhesive crackled once more. The fractures widened. And Kalari braced herself for whatever came next. Heat flared against Kalari's skin, a sharp contrast to the icy numbness that had settled into her bones. The plasma filament in James's hands hummed as he worked, applying carefully controlled bursts to the fractured adhesive. She clenched her jaw, suppressing the instinct to pull away. Any sudden movement could undo their delicate progress. The adhesive's surface warped under the heat, its frozen structure giving way. Tiny fractures spread outward like cracks in brittle glass, widening until Kalari felt the first true shift of her trapped limb. A gasp escaped her lips. James's eyes snapped up to meet hers. You felt that? She nodded once. It moved. Good. His voice was steady, but his movements quickened, his focus absolute. The alarms still blared through the station, an ever-present reminder that time was running out. A distant explosion rattled the floor beneath them. James cursed under his breath. That sounded way too close. Kalari forced herself to remain still. If the lockdown fails, the breach may reach this sector. James didn't stop working. Then we better hurry. The next burst of heat sent a ripple through the adhesive. A thin line of steam curled into the air as the weakened material strained against itself. Another fracture splintered outward. Kalari's fingers twitched, then curled inward on instinct. She could move her hand. James grinned. Hell yeah. Almost there. A second tremor rocked the station. The overhead lights flickered dangerously. In the distance, the echo of shouting voices and heavy footfalls filled the air. James exhaled sharply. All right, no more slow and steady. He flipped a setting on his multi-tool and the plasma filament brightened. Time for the last push. Kalari barely had time to brace herself before a final burst of energy coursed through the adhesive. The weakened bond reached its breaking point. A sharp snap cracked through the air. Then suddenly she was free. Kalari stumbled back, her balance momentarily thrown off. Her arm, once immobilized, now tingled with sharp pins and needles as sensation rushed back into her limb. She flexed her fingers, testing for damage. No fractures. No breaks. James let out a triumphant laugh. Told you I wasn't letting you lose an arm today. She looked at him, something unreadable in her gaze. You succeeded. He winked. Of course I did. But before she could respond, a metallic groan reverberated through the walls. The emergency bulkhead at the far end of the corridor shuddered, struggling to hold. James's expression hardened. That's not good. Kalari turned toward the others in the room. The gathered engineers and medics were already scrambling for the nearest exit, their expressions taut with urgency. A voice crackled over the intercom, distorted by static. Sector 6 compromised. Security teams, evacuate immediately. James grabbed Kalari's wrist. Time to go. They sprinted after the others, dodging fallen equipment as the station trembled beneath them. Kalari forced her legs to move faster, her freshly freed arms still stiff but functional. The air carried the acrid scent of burning circuitry, a sure sign that containment was failing. James, she started, but he cut her off with a sharp shake of his head. Don't think, just run. They rounded a corner just as the bulkhead behind them groaned once more, then gave way. A deafening boom sent a shockwave through the corridor. Kalari barely had time to throw herself forward before a violent gust of air sucked backward, pulling debris into the widening breach. She hit the ground hard, skidding on the cold metal floor. James crashed beside her, grabbing onto a railing before the decompression could pull him away. His other hand shot out, fingers closing around her wrist. Kalari's breath hitched. The force of the vacuum yanked at her body, her feet scraping helplessly against the floor. Hold on. James shouted, his grip tightening. She gritted her teeth, forcing her other hand toward the railing. The vacuum's pull lessened slightly as emergency systems activated, sealing the breach with a secondary containment field. Kalari scrambled onto solid footing, breathing hard. James exhaled in relief, but his fingers didn't release her wrist right away. You all right? He asked, his voice rough with exertion. She met his gaze, something unfamiliar twisting in her chest. I am functional. His lips quirked. You really gotta work on better answers. For a brief second, there was nothing but the sound of their breathing, the distant alarms, and the hum of the station struggling to stabilize. Then James pushed himself up, extending a hand. Come on. Let's get out of here before something else tries to kill us. Kalari hesitated, then placed her still tingling hand in his. Warm. Steady. Unyielding. As he pulled her to her feet, she found herself thinking, perhaps humans were impossible creatures after all. The corridor ahead stretched in flickering half-light, emergency strobes casting erratic shadows against the walls. Kalari matched James's pace as they ran, her freed arms still stiff but operational. Every breath she took was sharp with the scent of overheated circuitry, the distant fires in Sector 6 sending acrid smoke curling through the ventilation systems. James kept his grip firm around her wrist, only releasing her when they turned a sharp corner. His boots skidded slightly on the smooth deck plating, but he recovered with an instinctive balance that seemed ingrained in his very being. She found herself admiring that, his ability to adapt, to react with the precision of someone who had danced with danger before and learned to make it a partner rather than an enemy. They reached a junction where several paths split off, each leading deeper into the station. James hesitated, scanning the emergency signs that pulsed in urgent red. Hangars that way, he muttered, jerking his chin toward the leftmost corridor. A distant explosion sent a tremor through the floor, followed by a sickening metallic groan. Kalari stiffened. The structural integrity is failing. If we do not evacuate soon. Yeah, I know. James took a step forward, then stopped abruptly. Something felt wrong. Kalari sensed it too, a subtle shift in the air pressure, a stillness that had nothing to do with the alarms and everything to do with the unseen threat ahead. Her kind had keen instincts, honed over generations of surviving hostile environments. Right now, every fiber of her being urged caution. James turned his head slightly. You feel that? Yes, she murmured. Something waits ahead. A flicker of movement at the far end of the corridor confirmed her unease. The emergency lighting cast it in fragmented silhouette, tall, angular, inhuman. James tensed. That's not one of ours. Kalari had no idea what species the figure belonged to, but she knew hostility when she saw it. The way it moved, deliberate, assessing, reminded her of a predator sizing up its prey. The figure stepped forward and the dim light caught on metallic plating. Not armor. Exoskeletal reinforcement. Kalari barely had time to register the detail before the creature lunged. James shoved her aside just as a sharp projectile embedded itself into the wall where she'd been standing. She twisted mid-fall, landing in a crouch as her eyes locked onto the attacker. The thing was fast, too fast for its size. James didn't hesitate. He yanked the multi-tool from his belt, flipping it into a makeshift weapon. Go, he barked, stepping between Kalari and the creature. He should have listened. Logic dictated that she retreat, find another path, avoid unnecessary confrontation. But something in her rebelled against the idea of leaving him behind. The creature lunged again and James met it head-on. He ducked beneath a wild swing, jamming the plasma filament against its side. A burst of energy flared, followed by the acrid scent of burning chitin. The thing screeched, stumbling back. Kalari moved before she could second-guess herself. She darted in from the opposite angle, using the stiffness in her arm to her advantage. A calculated strike to the creature's exposed side sent it staggering. James capitalized on the opening. With a sharp twist of his wrist, he activated the multi-tool's high-frequency setting. The resulting pulse sent a concussive shock through the air, just enough to unbalance their attacker further. The creature reeled. Then, with an inhuman snarl, it turned and vanished into the shadows as quickly as it had appeared. James exhaled, his stance still tense, his grip white-knuckled around his makeshift weapon. Well, he muttered, that was fun. Kalari's pulse thundered in her ears. It retreated. Yeah, which means it's either regrouping or calling friends. Either way, we need to move. They wasted no time. The encounter had cost them precious minutes, and Kalari could feel the station's failing stability in every vibration beneath her feet. They ran in silence, following the emergency lighting toward the hangar bay. As they reached the final stretch, James stole a glance at her. You didn't run when I told you to. Kalari didn't look at him. You did not run either. His grin was brief but genuine. Guess that makes us both idiots. Perhaps. Or perhaps for the first time in her life, Kalari understood why humans never gave up. Not on a problem, not on survival, and not on each other. As the hangar doors loomed ahead, she realized one simple truth. If she had to choose between impossible odds and abandoning James, she would choose the fight. Every time. The hangar bay stretched before them, vast and chaotic, filled with the frenetic energy of last-minute evacuations. Engineers scrambled to secure cargo, pilots shouted final checks to their crews, and the ever-present wail of alarms underscored the urgency of it all. The scent of scorched metal and overheated thrusters clung to the air, thick enough to taste. James didn't slow as they pushed forward, his eyes scanning for an available ship. Kalari kept close, her muscles coiled in readiness. The encounter with the exoskeletal attacker still lingered in her mind, an unease settling in her bones. That had not been a random ambush. It had been an interception. Which meant, her thoughts cut off as James grabbed her arm, pulling her behind a stack of supply crates just as a new set of figures stormed into the hangar. Armed. Tactical. Not station security. James exhaled through his teeth. Damn it. That's not a rescue party. Kalari barely needed to confirm it. The way the newcomers moved, sweeping the area with precision, marked them as professionals. Mercenaries? Saboteurs? Either way, their arrival meant trouble. James tapped his wrist display, pulling up the station's emergency manifests. He swiped through the data, muttering under his breath. Most of these ships are already prepped for launch. If we time this right. A heavy impact shook the hangar, followed by the unmistakable groan of structural collapse somewhere deeper in the station. The mercenaries reacted instantly, barking orders into their comms. They weren't here for a firefight, they had a mission. And then Kalari saw it. A sleek transport vessel, docked near the far end of the bay. The insignia on its hull sent a cold jolt through her. It belonged to the same faction as their attacker. Her mind raced. If they were here, that meant the enemy hadn't simply retreated to regroup. They had reinforcements. Which meant. James stiffened beside her, his expression darkening. They're not just here for the station. He followed her gaze. They're here for something specific. Realization settled between them like a lead weight. We can't let them leave, Kalari said, her voice low but certain. James glanced at her, something unreadable flickering across his face. Then he gave a sharp nod. Agreed. They moved quickly, weaving through the chaos. The mercenaries were focused on their own objectives, but that wouldn't last long. Their best advantage was surprise, and once that was gone, it would be a fight neither of them could afford to lose. James reached the transport's access panel first, yanking open the maintenance hatch. I'll handle the override, he whispered. Cover me. Kalari turned, scanning the hangar. The mercenaries were still distracted, but not for long. She positioned herself near a stack of supply crates, her pulse steady, her senses heightened. James worked fast. His fingers danced over the console, bypassing security with a series of quick commands. The hatch released with a hiss. Got it, he murmured. Let's move. They slipped inside, the interior of the ship eerily silent. Dim emergency lighting cast long shadows against the walls. Kalari kept her steps light, listening for any sign of crew presence. James moved toward the cockpit, his movements precise. If we can disable the ship's systems before they board, they'll have no way to escape. Kalari nodded, already heading toward the engine controls. I will disable the primary thrusters. She reached the access panel, fingers moving over the controls, only to freeze as a voice echoed from behind. You should not be here. She spun. The exoskeletal warrior from before stood at the entrance to the compartment, its posture unreadable but its presence unmistakably hostile. James cursed. You again. The creature took a step forward, unhurried. You do not understand what you are interfering with. Kalari's grip tightened. Enlighten us. The warrior tilted its head. You are not ready to know. James exhaled sharply. Yeah, see, that's real ominous. Not exactly reassuring. The creature's gaze locked onto Kalari. Leave now and I will not pursue. Yes. A challenge. She lifted her chin. I refuse. The warrior moved. Kalari barely had time to react before it lunged, closing the distance in a blink. She twisted, dodging the first strike, countering with a sharp blow aimed at its reinforced plating. The impact vibrated up her arm, but she didn't relent. James was already moving, drawing the multi-tool and activating its high-frequency setting. He struck low, aiming for the creature's joints. Sparks flew as the energy field clashed against hardened exoskeleton. The warrior staggered back, assessing. Then it moved again, faster, striking with calculated precision. Kalari dodged, barely missing a strike that would have shattered bone. She countered with a feint, drawing its focus, giving James the opening he needed. He drove the multi-tool forward, embedding it into the creature's side. A burst of energy flared. The warrior let out a sharp, guttural sound, its form stiffening. For a moment the hangar's noise faded. Then with deliberate slowness the creature stepped back. It didn't collapse. Didn't retreat in pain. It simply looked at them. Then it spoke. This will not end here. It pressed something on its wrist. Kalari's eyes widened. James. Too late. A surge of energy pulsed through the ship's interior. Failsafe. A last resort. James grabbed her arm and ran. The explosion behind them sent a wave of force tearing through the ship. They barely cleared the exit before the blast consumed the transport, sending shrapnel in all directions. The force threw them forward, rolling across the hangar floor. Kalari barely managed to shield her face before debris rained down around them. Silence followed. Then James groaned. Hey. That hurt. Kalari pushed herself up, her breath unsteady. The transport was gone, reduced to twisted wreckage. The mercenaries? Scattered. He turned to James. Are you injured? He winced but grinned. Nothing permanent. You. She flexed her fingers. Functional. His grin widened. Told you. We don't give up that easy. She met his gaze. And for the first time she truly believed it. Smoke coiled in lazy tendrils through the ruined hangar, the scent of scorched metal thick in the air. The wreckage of the transport ship still smoldered, jagged remnants of its hull twisted into grotesque shapes. Kalari forced herself to breathe steadily, ignoring the sharp sting in her ribs. The explosion had sent them sprawling, but they were still alive. James pushed himself upright with a groan, rubbing his shoulder where he'd landed hard. "All right," he muttered, coughing once. "That could have gone better." Kalari's gaze swept the hangar, cataloging what remained. The mercenaries who had stormed in moments before were either unconscious, scrambling for cover, or retreating entirely. Their mission, whatever it had been, was now a failure. But the warrior, the exoskeletal enemy that had fought them with such precision, was gone. "James," she said, her voice low. "It activated an emergency teleport." He turned to her, grimacing. "Yeah, I figured. That blast was a distraction." A bitter weight settled in her chest. That thing had nearly killed them. Twice. And it had done so without hesitation, without anger. Just the cold efficiency of a being who considered them obstacles rather than opponents. James stood, rolling his shoulder. "We need to get off this station before it really starts falling apart." He pointed toward the few remaining ships still docked, most of them emergency evac vessels. "Think you can still move?" Kalari gave him a sharp look. "I am not the one who was flung across the hangar floor like an unbalanced cargo crate." He barked a laugh, short but genuine. "Fair point." They moved quickly, picking a smaller shuttle near the rear of the hangar. Most of the crew had already evacuated, leaving the ship in standby mode, accessible but unguarded. James punched in a quick override and the boarding ramp hissed open. The interior was compact but functional, meant for short-range evacuations. James slid into the pilot's chair, hands already moving over the controls. "All right, let's see if I can get this bucket in the air before." A tremor rocked the station, more violent than the last. Kalari grabbed onto the back of his chair for balance as a deep groan echoed through the structure. James muttered a curse. That was not a good sound. Kalari checked the external monitors. "The outer hull has sustained critical damage. The station will not hold much longer." "Yeah, definitely time to go." James flipped a series of switches, engaging the ship's engines. The console flashed warnings, mostly about the station's destabilization, but nothing that would prevent them from launching. As the thrusters powered up, Kalari spared one last glance at the wreckage outside. The mercenaries were retreating, scattering like shadows. Whatever they had been after, it hadn't survived the explosion. James followed her gaze. "They weren't here just to kill us," he said, voice quieter now. "They were after something big." Kalari nodded. "And they were willing to die for it." That thought unsettled her more than she expected. She had seen fanatics before, zealots willing to sacrifice themselves for a cause. But this was different. The exoskeletal warrior, its focus had been absolute, its actions measured. It had not been desperate. It had been certain. James exhaled, then shook his head. "We'll figure it out later. Right now we're getting out of here." With a final flick of his wrist, he activated the launch sequence. The shuttle vibrated beneath them as the docking clamps released. The main thrusters roared to life, and the ship lifted from the hangar floor, angling toward the nearest exit. The view beyond was chaos. Fragments of the station drifted into the void, illuminated by distant fires still raging in its lower sectors. Escape pods and other emergency vessels streaked away from the structure, scattering in all directions. James guided them through the debris, jaw tight with concentration. "Hang on," he murmured as he adjusted their trajectory. "This is gonna be close." A warning alarm blared as a section of the station collapsed ahead, sending massive chunks of metal spiraling outward. James jerked the controls, weaving through the wreckage with practiced skill. Kalari's grip on the seat tightened. "James." "I see it," he muttered. A massive girder tumbling directly in their path. James yanked the controls hard, thrusters flaring as he sent the shuttle into a sharp roll. The girder scraped past their hull, missing them by meters. The ship shuddered but held. Then clear space. The moment they were free of the immediate wreckage, James let out a breath. He adjusted their heading, stabilizing their flight path. Kalari finally exhaled. That was reckless. His lips quirked into a half-smile. But effective. She could not argue. For a long moment they simply sat in silence, the vast emptiness of space stretching before them. The station behind them continued its slow, inevitable collapse, breaking apart piece by piece. Kalari finally turned to him. "Where do we go now?" James leaned back in his chair, rubbing his forehead. "That's a damn good question." She studied him, his expression thoughtful but weary. "You do not regret staying to fight?" His gaze met hers. "Do you?" She thought about the warrior, about the mission those mercenaries had died for. About the unshakable certainty in their enemy's voice when it had said, "This will not end here." "No," she admitted. "I do not." James nodded, expression unreadable. Then he sighed. "Well, wherever we're going, we're gonna need a plan. And probably a drink." Kalari tilted her head. "You intend to solve this problem with alcohol?" "Not solve," he corrected. "Just make it temporarily less terrible." Despite herself, she felt the smallest hint of amusement. "Then let us find somewhere safe to consider our next steps." James smirked. "See? Now you're thinking like a human." She shook her head but didn't argue. Perhaps after everything she finally understood why humans never gave up. And why, despite the chaos, despite the danger, she had no intention of leaving his side. The hum of the ship's engines was steady, a rhythmic vibration that filled the cabin with a quiet sense of movement. Beyond the viewport, space stretched out in an endless expanse, broken only by distant pinpricks of starlight. James sat at the helm, fingers tapping absently against the console as he stared at the nav screen, deep in thought. Kalari sat nearby, arms crossed, her gaze fixed on the same screen. The ship's destination was still undetermined, a blinking cursor waiting for a decision. They had escaped the station, evaded the mercenaries, and yet there was no sense of relief. "Not yet. We cannot keep drifting," she said finally, breaking the silence. James exhaled through his nose. "Yeah. I know." The weight of what they had seen on the station lingered between them. That warrior, the exoskeletal being that had fought with such precision, wasn't just another hired gun. It had spoken with certainty as if it knew something they didn't. And the mercenaries had fought with the conviction of people willing to die for their cause. Kalari shifted in her seat. "We need answers. That warrior did not intend to kill us out of personal hatred. It was part of something larger." James ran a hand through his hair. "And I hate not knowing what that something is." His gaze flicked to the long-range scanner. "But I bet we can find out." Kalari followed his look. The scanner was picking up faint trails, energy signatures, scattered remnants of ships that had left the station in a hurry. The mercenaries who had survived were out there somewhere, and if they had a fallback point, a rallying location, it was only a matter of finding it. She nodded. "We track them." James smirked. "I like the way you think." He adjusted the ship's course, aligning their heading with the most recent signature. It wasn't a strong trail, but it was enough to follow. The ship responded smoothly, engines shifting as they moved into pursuit. Hours passed in quiet tension. They kept their speed low, careful not to announce their presence. The mercenaries had fled in different directions, but a handful of them seemed to be converging on a single point. A distant moon, its surface obscured by dense storm clouds. Kalari leaned forward. "That is not a base." James frowned. "No. But it's something." The scanner picked up activity. Ships descending into the atmosphere, their energy trails vanishing beneath the thick cloud cover. Whatever was down there, the mercenaries were regrouping. Kalari's mandibles tightened. It could be a trap. James gave her a lopsided grin. "Yeah, probably." She sighed. "And we are going anyway." "Damn right we are." He guided the ship lower, angling toward the edge of the storm system. The controls vibrated as they hit atmospheric turbulence, but he kept the descent smooth, weaving between the clouds. Visibility dropped to near zero, lightning flashing around them in eerie bursts. Kalari scanned the terrain below. There, a break in the storm. James adjusted course, dropping through the gap. The ground emerged in flickering glimpses, jagged cliffs, winding rivers of molten rock, and a series of structures nestled against the cliffs. A hidden outpost. The ships they had followed were docked along the outer platforms, personnel moving quickly between them. From this distance it was impossible to tell what they were guarding, but the outpost was active. Too active for a mere retreat point. James clenched his jaw. "They're protecting something." Kalari studied the layout. The facility was fortified but not impenetrable. If they landed outside the perimeter and approached on foot, they might be able to get close without triggering alarms. She met James's gaze. Stealth approach. He nodded. Stealth approach. The ship touched down a safe distance from the outpost, hidden in the rocky landscape. The air outside was thick with heat, a dry wind carrying the scent of minerals and scorched stone. James adjusted the straps on his gear. You ready? Kalari flexed her claws. Always. They moved quickly, sticking to the shadows, navigating the terrain with practiced ease. The outpost loomed ahead, its metallic surface dull beneath the stormlight. James motioned for a stop as they reached the edge of the perimeter. He pointed to a section of the facility, an entrance less guarded than the others. A possible way in. Kalari nodded. We move now. No hesitation. No turning back. This was where they would find their answers. Or their fight. The entrance was barely guarded. A single sentry paced near the doorway, their rifles slung low, attention drifting. The mercenaries must have assumed that no one would be reckless enough to follow them into this storm-racked wasteland. That was their first mistake. James pressed himself against the rock, his breathing steady. He glanced at Kalari, who remained still, eyes locked on the guard with an almost predatory focus. She was waiting for his signal. He nodded once. She moved like a shadow. A swift step forward, a sharp twist, and the guard barely had time to gasp before she struck, her clawed hand wrapping around their throat just enough to cut off sound. A second later, the mercenary was on the ground, unconscious. James exhaled. Remind me never to be on your bad side. Kalari gave him a sideways glance. Then do not make yourself an enemy. He grinned but didn't push his luck. They dragged the unconscious guard behind a stack of supply crates and turned their attention to the door. The panel was old, the kind of security system that had been patched together over the years but never fully upgraded. James crouched, pulling a small device from his belt and hooking it into the access port. Give me a sec, he murmured. His fingers danced over the interface, bypassing layers of outdated encryption. Almost there. The lock released with a soft click. The door slid open just wide enough for them to slip inside. The corridor beyond was dimly lit, the overhead lights flickering in places. It smelled of fuel and old metal with the faintest hint of something acrid, something chemical. The facility was more than just a hiding place. Kalari's mandibles twitched. They are manufacturing something. James had the same thought. The low hum of machinery filled the air, the rhythmic churn of automated systems at work. He motioned her forward, keeping his footsteps light against the metal floor. They passed through the hallways without incident, pausing at intersections to listen for movement. The mercenaries were deeper inside, their voices carrying through the ventilation shafts in muffled echoes. A storage room lay ahead, its door half open. James peered inside and froze. Crates lined the walls, each one marked with symbols he didn't recognize. But what caught his attention were the rows of cylinders stacked neatly on reinforced shelves, glass-like tubes filled with a swirling, dark substance. The way it moved, sluggish and almost alive, sent a chill through him. Kalari stepped closer. What is that? James shook his head. I don't know. But I don't like it. He moved to one of the crates and pried it open. Inside were data pads, reports filled with strange, looping script. Kalari picked one up, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the text. This is not just a mercenary operation, she said. This is research. They are harvesting something. James's stomach tightened. Harvesting what? Before she could answer, a voice rang out from the hallway. Hey, who's in there? Footstep. Then another. James swore under his breath, shoving the datapad into his jacket as Kalari darted behind a stack of crates. The mercenary entered, rifle raised, eyes sweeping the room. They didn't get a chance to react. Kalari struck fast, slamming into them before they could fire. The guard hit the ground hard, but not before their fingers squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out like a thunderclap. James knew what that meant. Footsteps. Shouting. The echo of voices bouncing off the walls. Kalari turned to him. We need to go. Now. He didn't argue. They sprinted for the opposite door, slipping through just as alarms blared to life. Red lights bathed the hallways, casting long, flickering shadows. James cursed. Guess we're done sneaking. Kalari's lips curled in something that wasn't quite a smile. Then we fight. Boots pounded against metal as mercenaries rounded the corner, rifles raised. James yanked his own weapon free, firing before they had a chance to react. The first guard dropped and Kalari was already moving, closing the distance in a blur. The fight was fast and brutal. They took down 3 before the rest pulled back, regrouping behind cover. The air filled with the sharp scent of burned ozone as plasma fire scorched the walls around them. James ducked behind a support beam, gritting his teeth. Any ideas? Kalari's eyes flicked toward a junction ahead. We split. I circle around. James hesitated. He didn't like splitting up. But they didn't have a choice. He nodded. Go. She vanished down the side corridor, her movements silent despite the chaos. James took a breath, then leaned out and fired, drawing their attention. A moment later there was a sharp cry, a flash of movement, and then Kalari was behind them, striking with precision. Within seconds it was over. James exhaled, lowering his weapon. I really don't want to know where you learned to do that. Kalari tilted her head. You fight messily. But effectively. He snorted. I'll take that as a compliment. They didn't linger. More reinforcements would be coming. But as they ran, James's mind was already racing. The mercenaries weren't just fighting for money. They were guarding something. Something dangerous. And now he and Kalari were right in the middle of it. The pounding of boots against metal grated in James's ears as he and Kalari sprinted down the dimly lit corridor. The alarms shrieked overhead, red lights flashing in chaotic intervals, casting everything in a blood-stained glow. They weren't just being pursued, they were being hunted. These mercenaries weren't scrambling in confusion anymore. They had adapted, regrouped, and now they were closing in. James stole a glance at Kalari, her movements fluid despite the tension. Her claws flexed, shoulders tensed, every part of her body coiled and ready to strike. She was already thinking 3 moves ahead, mapping out escape routes, potential ambush points. Survival distilled into instinct. They are hurting us, she said, voice low but edged with certainty. James cursed under his breath. Of course they were. The corridors of this facility weren't random. There was a design to them and their pursuers knew it. The mercenaries weren't trying to gun them down in the open. They wanted to box them in. Drive them into a place where they had no cover, no angles, no way out. They know this place, he muttered. We don't. Kalari flicked her mandibles, considering. Then we changed the game. Ahead, the corridor split. A forked path, one direction leading deeper into the facility, the other turning sharply downward toward what looked like maintenance access. James skidded to a stop, eyes flicking between the 2 routes. Which way? Kalari didn't hesitate. Down. She grabbed his arm and yanked him after her just as plasma fire ripped through the air where they had been standing. The mercenaries had reached the intersection, their shouts mixing with the hiss of overheated metal. They tumbled down a short flight of steps, landing hard against a grated floor. The maintenance level was darker, the emergency lights barely flickering. A thick acrid smell filled the air, coolant, machinery oil, and something else beneath it, something sharp and metallic. James steadied himself. Tau what? Kalari turned, scanning the walls. Pipes ran overhead, interwoven with exposed wiring. Utility hatches lined the corridor, some rusted shut, others slightly ajar. She reached for one and wrenched it open with a sharp tug. In. James didn't argue. He crawled inside, feeling the heat of the cramped metal tunnel wrap around him like a second skin. Kalari followed, pulling the hatch shut just as their pursuers reached the stairwell. Through the vent's slats, James saw Boots rushing past, heard the clipped, professional tones of the mercenaries barking orders. They went down. Keep pressure on both sides. Don't let them double back. Another voice, deeper, more authoritative. They won't be going anywhere. We have them. James held his breath, listening as the footsteps faded. They weren't retreating, just repositioning. The mercenaries still believed they were out in the open, searching for a way forward. Kalari exhaled slowly. That buys us time. But not much. James adjusted his position, his back pressed awkwardly against the curved metal. We need to figure out what the hell they're protecting down here. Kalari nodded. If they are willing to trap us, whatever is at the heart of this facility is worth more to them than our deaths. The tunnel stretched ahead, leading deeper into the base. James started crawling, moving as quietly as he could. The further they went, the thicker the air became, tinged with something unnatural. An electric charge that made the fine hairs on his arms stand on end. Then he saw the glow. It was faint at first, a pulsing blue light filtering through the vents ahead. As they reached the end of the tunnel, James peered through a grated opening and felt his stomach drop. Below them, a vast chamber opened up, lined with reinforced barriers and containment units. At the center of the room stood a massive cylindrical structure, surrounded by scaffolding and control stations. But it was what was inside that made his breath hitch. Suspended in thick, translucent fluid, a dark mass coiled and twisted, its form never quite settling. It pulsed with the same eerie blue light, shifting between something almost solid and something that looked impossibly fluid. The shadows within it writhed like something alive, something aware. James felt an instinctive chill crawl up his spine. What in the hell is that? Kalari was silent for a long moment. Then her voice came low and unreadable. A weapon. James swallowed hard. He had seen dangerous things before. Black market tech, experimental plasma warheads, even biological horrors designed to melt through armor like it was wax. But this was different. This wasn't just dangerous. It was wrong. We can't let them keep it, he muttered. Kalari's mandibles tightened. Then we destroy it. James almost laughed, but the sound never left his throat. You have a plan for that? She looked down at the sprawling facility beneath them, eyes calculating. We make one. James exhaled, bracing himself against the metal. I really hope your plans involve fewer near-death experiences than mine do. Kalari's eyes gleamed in the dim light. Unlikely. James smirked despite the dread curling in his gut. They had stumbled into something far bigger than a mercenary job. And now they had a choice. Walk away and pretend they never saw it, or take the kind of risk that got people killed. He already knew what choice they were going to make. His grip tightened on the vent's edge. Let's wreck their day. The plan was reckless, but there was no time for hesitation. James and Kalari moved with silent precision, slipping through the vent system until they found a secondary access panel. It led to a catwalk overlooking the containment chamber, and from here, they had a clear view of the facility's central control station. The mercenaries were positioned strategically, guards patrolling the perimeter while technicians monitored the pulsating entity within the containment cylinder. It writhed with slow, deliberate movements, its shifting form pressing against the transparent barrier like something testing its prison. Every now and then, a ripple of blue light flickered through the liquid, casting shadows that danced across the walls. James tapped Kalari's shoulder and motioned toward the power relays along the chamber's outer ring. If they could disable those, the containment field would destabilize. Whatever that thing was, the mercenaries clearly feared it enough to keep it locked up tight. A moment of chaos would be their best chance to act. She nodded, understanding his unspoken thought. Splitting up was dangerous but necessary. James crept along the grated walkway, staying low as he positioned himself above one of the key relays. Kalari moved in the opposite direction, her lithe form disappearing into the shadows. The first strike had to be fast. Precise. James took a steadying breath, pulled the stolen plasma cutter from his belt, and activated it with a quiet hum. The beam sliced into the conduit, sparks flying as the energy lines within ruptured. Below, warning sirens blared, and a technician spun toward the display panels, shouting something James couldn't hear over the sudden roar of cascading failures. Then came the second explosion. Kalari had struck her target. The entire chamber shook as the containment field flickered, its stabilizers straining under the sudden loss of power. The mercenaries reacted instantly, weapons drawn, barking orders as they scrambled to assess the damage. James didn't wait. He vaulted over the railing, landing hard on the platform below. Pain jolted through his knees, but he forced himself to move, dashing toward the control station. A guard spun toward him, raising his rifle. Too slow. James drove a fist into his gut, yanked the weapon from his grasp and slammed the butt of it into his temple. The mercenary crumpled. Kalari struck from the shadows, her claws flashing as she took down another enemy with brutal efficiency. The remaining guards scrambled for cover, but they were reacting, not acting. James took aim and fired a suppressing burst at the nearest console, shattering screens and sending the technicians diving for safety. Then the chamber filled with an unnatural sound. A deep, resonant thrum reverberated through the air as the containment cylinder flickered erratically. The entity within surged against the weakened barrier, its form shifting, stretching, reaching. The technicians were panicked now, scrambling to override the shutdown. One of them screamed something into a communicator. A distress call. Reinforcements were coming. Kalari leapt onto the main console, driving her claws into the exposed wiring, tearing through the last failsafe. The containment field collapsed. The entire room plunged into a deathly stillness. The entity did not explode outward in rage. It did not lash out with wild, uncontrollable fury. It simply unraveled. The shifting darkness peeled away in slow, deliberate strands, and for the first time, James saw something resembling a shape within. A glimmer of something almost humanoid, something watching. Then the weight of its presence crashed into him, an invisible force pressing against his mind. His vision swam, his heartbeat faltered. He had faced death before, fought men and creatures that could tear him apart, but this was different. This was not fear. This was understanding. It was looking at him. Not at the others. Not at Kalari. Him. A whisper curled through his thoughts, a language he didn't know yet somehow recognized. You're not like them. His breath hitched. The chamber around him felt distant, muffled, like he was standing at the edge of something vast, something beyond comprehension. And then, as quickly as it had come, the pressure vanished. The entity collapsed in on itself, shrinking into a single point of darkness before dispersing completely. The fluid within the containment chamber spilled out onto the floor, leaving nothing behind. James staggered back, his pulse hammering. Kalari landed beside him, her breathing controlled but tense. What just happened? He swallowed hard, shaking his head. He didn't have an answer. Alarms wailed through the facility, and distant footsteps signaled the arrival of more mercenaries. Whatever they had just unleashed, whatever had seen him, it was gone now. But the consequences of their actions were far from over. James exhaled sharply. We need to move. Kalari nodded once, and together they ran.